All right. Perhaps we're going to get started. Thank you to everybody that is here today. Thank you for joining us for this very important discussion on the misinformation challenge that we have in Canada, how we can rebuild trust in a post-truth world. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Felix Prougialdo. I'm the interim director at Evidence for Democracy. We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that champions the integration of scientific evidence in government decision-making because we believe doing so leads to better outcomes for all Canadians, regardless of their political affiliation, left, right, whatever. When we make decisions that are informed by scientific evidence, it leads to better outcomes for everybody. I'd like to briefly just acknowledge that the offices that Evidence for Democracy sits on are situated in Ottawa, which are on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe nations. So I would like to recognize and respect their enduring relationship to this land, and I'm very grateful to be here today with all of you. As you may have heard when we started this event, this event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube platform. So just be aware of that. But if your camera is not on, you will not be recorded. So you don't have to worry about that. It's a real pleasure to be here today with four leading experts in the field of misinformation, digital policy, media literacy, all of that. The flow of the panel event today, it's not going to be me talking. I'm going to leave a lot of time for our experts here to be talking amongst themselves, answering a couple of questions that we will have. I will keep some time, about 10 minutes before the end of the hour here, for them to address your questions that you may have during the webinar today. So feel free to use the Q&A feature in Zoom that you may see at the bar there below. There are also two E4D staff members in the audience. There's Rumit and Trevor that will be answering any questions you may have along the way. And if you have particular questions for the experts, we'll address them at the end, hopefully. So feel free to use the Q&A feature. With all of that being said, I think I will let our panelists introduce themselves and, just tell us your name, your work, where you work, what kind of affiliation you'd like to spotlight for us today. And perhaps as a quick, opening question to start the conversation today, tell us about how misinformation or disinformation materializes in the work that you do every day. So perhaps we'll start with Heidi, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Heidi Tworek. I'm a Canada Research Chair and a Professor of History and Public Policy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, where I also direct the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. So my work looks at both the history and contemporary policy of how new communications technologies affect democracy. And the question of misinformation, disinformation, poor quality information crops up not just in the historical work I've done, but also, of course, in the contemporary work as well. So one of the things I'm always interested in is really trying to understand what is new about the crises that we are facing and what is actually fairly old. If we look historically, we see this problem waxes and wanes, and the question is not to remove completely poor quality information, conspiracy theories, etc., but rather how do we get ourselves into the waning period? So that's the lens that I bring to a lot of this work. And then specifically in the more contemporary aspect of it, I look at a whole range of things related to mis and disinformation, but particularly in the Canadian space, I'm very interested in how online harassment of professional groups contributes to the quality of information online.
That is perfect. Thank you. Jessica, would you like to go next?
Thanks. It's great to be here. So I'm Jessica Johnson. I'm the project lead for a project called What Should the CBC Be? That was a 2-year research project at McGill University's Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy. I'm currently working on a new journalism project with some colleagues that I'm really excited about and can't talk about. And I also teach journalism and media studies at the University of Toronto. As far as misinformation and disinformation goes, we've seen a sharp decline in trust in traditional media, public and private, all over the world in the last 10 years, say. And in English media, it's particularly acute. So, what we know is that the rise and proliferation of misinformation and disinformation actually reduces credibility of media overall. And that's something that every journalist I know is actively working to fight right now.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Perhaps Matthew, would you like to go next?
Thanks. So I'm Matthew Johnson, and I'm the Director of Education for Media Smarts, which is Canada's Centre for Digital Media Literacy. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, and in those 30 years, we've been working to ensure that all Canadians have the critical thinking skills they need to understand and to actively engage with media of all kinds. And of course, that includes dealing with factual information, recognizing misinformation, finding good quality information, and particularly teaching not just young people, but all Canadians how to manage the flood of information that we deal with every day, how to discern truth from falsehood, and how to customize our approaches for those different audiences who are really dealing, although they're all dealing with misinformation and disinformation as challenges, they're dealing with them in different contexts and have to learn different skills to address them.
Incredible work that you're doing, Matthew. And yes, I mean, all of you, obviously, this is going to be a very interesting discussion today. Last but not least, Valérie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course, thank you for having me. So I'm Valérie. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. I'm currently a visiting researcher at the Montreal Centre for International Studies at the University of Montreal. And I am really interested in how disinformation impacts democracies. And so I'm less researching the kind of individual narratives you might see on social media, for example, but I'm much more interested in the broader impacts of these information flows on democracies, how it impacts how we view each other, how it impacts how we view our government, for example, and essentially how we can build democratic resilience. And so I'm really interested in seeing how disinformation exploits the vulnerabilities inherent in democracies. And I take a particular interest in other democracies as well. And so I am a comparativist by trade. And so I look at North America, but I also look at Scandinavia and the Baltics as well to see different approaches, why they work in some places, why they might not work in others.
That is so interesting. And I mean, this is a perfect kind of segue into the first question that I wanted to ask all of you, actually. We heard recently from the Foreign Interference Commissioner in Canada, Commissioner Hogue, and they called mis and disinformation an existential threat and the single biggest risk to Canadian democracy. We also heard recently from the World Economics Forum in their global risk reports that they also identify mis and disinformation as the second highest global risk, all risk considered over the next 2 years. So, from your perspective, and, you all work in different fields and different sectors, what would you say makes misinformation today more pervasive or potent than it was in the past? Why are we talking about this so much now in 2026? And I open this up to any of you who would like to jump in this topic. It's a very broad
I'll,
question.
I'll go first and then pass it, but I think we're really not talking enough about the predominance suddenly of AI overview and search results and how the public has sort of just shifted to those platforms and asking ChatGPT and other platforms for information, which they are simply not beholden to revealing what their sources are and how they verified them. So there's a whole conversation that's happening a lot in academic circles, but not so much on a public level about what the final cost of this will be. But we're seeing it show up in headlines now.
Maybe I can jump on that and just say that the BBC actually did a study looking at the accuracy of those summaries of news articles and found that at least a third of them were inaccurate in their summaries of news. So that I think, though, maybe just to build on your question and put on my historian hat, in a way, what I see is Gen AI accelerating a lot of trends that existed before in the social media space. So one way to think about this is to very basically separate the kind of motives we have for mis and disinformation, or particularly disinformation. So some are political, right? Foreign interference, etc. And of course, that's what the commissioner was looking at. But there are also all sorts of economic motives, right? We can think 10 years ago of the infamous Macedonian teenagers who interfered in the 2016 US election, and they tried pro-Hillary Clinton. They didn't make a lot of money, so they switched to, Pope endorses Donald Trump, etc. And they were agnostic about what they wrote. They just wanted to make money with it. So I think we need to understand that it's these two factors coming together, whether on social media platforms or now within Gen AI, that make this a potentially potent force. Because obviously the commissioner is looking at the political side, but the economic side is a huge factor as well.
Yeah, and I think as well, we can't discount the value of sharing mis or disinformation simply for social clout, because we know that that is another one of the most common motives, particularly if it's mis or disinformation that favors your side of whatever the identity issue is. It's a way of building up your social status, either in a quantifiable way, like gaining followers, but also in a less quantifiable way, just in building your status in a less tangible way, or even just having an emotional charge. Certainly, a lot of the work that's been done with individuals sharing, particularly some of these so-called cyborg accounts that are, real people who act like bots, essentially, just constantly sharing information that supports their side without any care of whether it's true or not. That emotional charge of fighting for your side is a major motivation, even if they're not getting anything tangible from it. But I wanted to touch as well on AI, because I really do feel like the rapid adoption of AI as an information source is as much a symptom of our current situation. Because I think what appeals to people about it is the seeming certainty that, compared to doing a search where you get 10 results and you're expected to sort it out for yourself, or even trying to look in the news and finding a bunch of different perspectives, the AI has an oracular quality. It behaves as though it is absolutely certain. And we know, in fact, that one of the ways to make these chatbots more accurate is to give them explicit permission to not be certain, to express uncertainty, to say how certain they are on different points. You can actually improve their accuracy, but that's not what people want from them. People want a fluent, confident answer. And I think to a certain extent, that shows the situation that we're in, where our information ecosystem has frayed. We've lost our faith in the old sources of reliable information, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, to the point where people are willing to trade away accuracy in exchange for confidence, in exchange for having a single source that tells them this is the truth, even if it is only true 2/3 of the time.
And to your point, Matthew, if we don't exercise that muscle of doing the research and making decisions between information that is accurate, information that is inaccurate, if we are being fed prefabricated answers that seem so confident, we over time lose that ability to do that proper research. The ease with which we can get a response on ChatGPT, for instance, it can't be overstated how much we will as a society move towards that, because we're busy, because we have so much going on. And this is something that really, really concerns me, is losing that ability to think critically, losing that ability to do the research, losing that ability to understand nuance, right? That a source might say something, another source might say something else. How can I make those decisions?
Absolutely. I mean, building these critical skills, thinking about the education, all of this training basically that we give to our youth is essential going forward. But maybe before and I want to touch on this obviously perhaps a bit later. But since we already started talking about, this emerging technology that is AI and people's, say, increasing use of social media as or these AI platforms as sources of information. I had a question perhaps for Heidi or for Jessica. These communication technologies that are being increasingly used specifically by younger folks, right, by Gen Z. What would you say? How do these communication channels or platforms tell us about how trust is built or is influenced in Canadian society these days?
Do you
I
want to go
think
first, Jessica, or shall I?
oh, we both have an answer. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, so it's obviously a really interesting question because actually some more international comparative research seems to indicate that social media has peaked, actually, that there's now a slight decline in the number of hours that people are generally spending on social media. It's still quite some hours, but on average it is slowly starting to decline, which I think is an interesting indication that there's perhaps some disillusionment with these platforms. And that's also true for Gen Z. Now, it doesn't mean there's zero time spent on them. They're still very important, but it's just an interesting, I think, perspective to know that this is changing. There is clearly some critique going on here. But in terms of trust building, some of the research that I've done, particularly through something called the Bridge Research Consortium, which is looking at vaccine hesitancy, is we've been looking then specifically at online vaccine discourse. And what we find is a real difference between how different types of players actually operate online, right? So influencers in general will be hoping to have more horizontal connections. They're interacting with people. And so you can see how that's a trust building thing, right? You say something, influencer replies to you, there's a more reciprocal relationship. Whereas government tends to be more broadcast, right? More vertical, says something, doesn't react back, maybe doesn't seem to be listening in their online behavior. So if we think about trust building as something that is both listening as well as speaking, when I describe these two different modes of behavior that we see through very large amounts of data, I think that starts to explain some of the issues for those who are perhaps more likely to be getting their information on social media than elsewhere.
And yeah, to pick up on what Heidi's saying, trust really is built through representation and a journalistic presence, whether that's in someone's social media feed or in their community. And I'm going to leap back to our research on public media a little bit. But what we found was that a surprising number of Canadians couldn't name a Canadian journalist that they trusted. The most trusted name was Peter Mansbridge, who is awesome, but it actually has been quite some time since he was on the nightly news in CBC. So it's not like some other young newsfluencer had really stepped in to fill that mantle. Props to Peter. But the other thing was more than half of Canadians don't have enough local news options. And that's true even of people who live in big cities like Toronto, Vancouver. And it gets worse the farther you get out of a big city. So I'm speaking to two problems right now, but for young people, traditional media hasn't really connected with them on their platforms the way that it would need to get them back in that flow. I agree with Heidi that they're incredibly skeptical. My room full of 20-year-old journalism students is the most critical audience I've ever met of any generation I've ever worked with. So yay them. But with the decline of professional media, what we're seeing is the loss of impact in communities, and that has a direct effect on how people are likely to trust the media.
That is so interesting, and I want to build up on that a little bit. And Valérie and Matthew, please feel free to jump in if this speaks to you. But in recent years, we've seen kind of a growth in these science influencers, if I can call them like that. Scientists, medical experts that are working on these social media platforms, partly to counter misinformation. There's many big names, Simon Clark, Big Manny, Dr. Mike, to debate a lot of skeptics, for example. Are there lessons that we can learn from these science influencers? How does that kind of build in to the traditional media ecosystem? What can we learn from them?
Can jump in. I love that you mentioned Dr. Mike, big fan, but mainly big fan not because of the conversation content, but his approach to discourse and empathy. I think we can learn a lot from. I love the way that he discusses calmly. I love the way that he asks questions. I love the way that he makes opponents really feel heard and understood, because I think that that is one of the reasons why we have such knee-jerk reactions. We feel attacked all the time. We're always on the defensive, and it makes us dig our heels so much more into our beliefs. And so what I think we can learn from this influencer playbook is that, politicians could be on social media and their use of social media could be better. I think if it's more civic literacy focused, there was a congressman in the U.S. who I don't think is doing this anymore, but at some point he was called Jim Johnson, and he was doing TikToks, and he was in his living room, in a hoodie, and really just explaining what was going on with bills that are trying to be passed, etc. And it was just very I'm going to use a French word here, décontracté, very relaxed. And it wasn't polished. And I think this is the challenge, is that a lot of politicians have these massive media teams that are behind content. And it's so evident when the content is polished and prepared. And a lot of times they're trying to follow Instagram or TikTok trends, right? They're trying to be funny, they're trying to be relatable, which is fine. But I think that is not the best way for them to leverage that influencer playbook. I think the way to leverage it is to be a politician, but to be a little more relaxed and to talk about the actual issues going on, and to kind of communicate this information and do some, vulgarisation. I'm sorry, I've throwing French words in there, but to try to communicate these very complex political questions a little bit more easily for the average person. So I think there is a lot to be learned from these influencers.
And maybe to jump on that, I mean, we do have efforts to do this in Canada as well, like Science Up First, which started during the pandemic, and I think has really tried to make sure that there are responsive to also lots of communities on the ground. So this is not, they don't just make a social media thread out of nowhere, but you really try and listen to different types of communities and figure out what are people interested in, what can we actually help them with understanding. But maybe I can just take this question a slightly different direction and say, I think part of the issue for many people who want to communicate about science and talk about it is online harassment. And I've seen this in my work on online harassment of health communicators. I mean, we know how many people jumped into the fray when COVID broke out and were using social media both for information, but also to inform publics. They were doing it off the side of their desks at this incredibly difficult time, because they wanted people to understand what was happening and to see sort of live scientific debate. But by the time it got to 2021, 2022, a lot of them were experiencing such levels of online abuse and harassment that they either dialed down or turned away from these platforms. And so what does that mean? It means it leaves a space for the lower quality information. And there's, so many layers of how you can deal with this. One is, of course, how do you protect yourself as an individual? The other is your employer or your institution having your back, which was a problem for a lot of these people. Then there's, of course, the platforms, then there's government regulation, then there's society. But all of this to say that I think one of the issues in the science space particularly is that many of these people who really try to communicate experience such high levels of online abuse and harassment that they have withdrawn, and others are fearful of entering into it because they're worried about what will happen to them.
I mean, that is very difficult to navigate, but that is a very good point as well that you're making. Yes. I'm reading some of the questions that are rolling in the Q&A, and someone was mentioning the news ban on social media that we've been dealing with in Canada since 2023. Perhaps, would one of you like to touch on this? Perhaps Matthew, how do you see this kind of affect people, in their, digital skills, let's say?
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen that it's had an impact, particularly on older Canadians, because it's important to point out this news ban. It's not on all social media; it's on Meta platforms. Instagram was never a big channel for mainstream news. It is a big part of how young people get news, but they're not getting it from the kinds of organizations that are covered by the news ban. But Facebook was a big part of how older Canadians got news, and it still is. So they're not getting news from mainstream news organizations. They're not getting news, at least Canadian news, from organizations that have the kind of processes the kind of procedures and standards that mean you can trust what they're saying. So I think we have seen a lot of um, other lower quality sources of information filling that gap, just as Heidi was saying around science communication. And we also know it's had a particularly big impact on northern and rural and remote communities that, again, relied heavily on Facebook, specifically because there were versions of Facebook that were very data light and so were more suitable for use when, in those parts of the country where data is still at a premium. So yeah, there's no question that it has had an impact, and I think it's also, of course, had an impact in making it more difficult for Canadian news organizations to reach young people because one of the two, or really three major platforms that young people use is closed to them. So they can try to reach through TikTok and they can try to reach through YouTube, but Instagram is not really open to them.
My colleagues, I hope it's okay to jump in.
Of course.
My colleagues at the Media Ecosystem Observatory at McGill studied this, and it's covered in the great new report by Evidence for Democracy. But that there was a sharp drop in the amount of news Canadians consumed. It's not like when Facebook and Instagram went off news that we filled it in with all of these other amazing news sources. A lot of people just stopped consuming news, and our feeds filled up with other stuff. The other impact was that a large number of like smaller outlets across Canada just stopped publishing because that had been their distribution platform. And that's where we see the vulnerability of the media to the technology of the day. So in 2 or 3 years, we probably will be talking about new platforms that don't exist yet and don't yet shape our world. But when you're a small player, the economics are just kind of working against you. So here we are.
So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've just touched on institutions a little bit, thinking about our Canadian government, for example, our national broadcasters, CBC, Radio-Canada. We've seen in the last years kind of a trust crisis, sorry, in these public institutions. In 2024, the OECD did a big study on public trust. And what they found was that about half of the Canadians, a little less than half, reported that they had low to no trust in the federal government. This is quite worrying to hear, as this is the government that makes a lot of important decisions for us. So, how, perhaps a question for Valerie or for Heidi, how does misinformation and disinformation kind of contribute to this decline in trust that we have in institutions, whether it's the journalistic ecosystem or government? How does that fit in?
I can jump in. It's a kind of chicken and egg problem, like which one came first? Is, disinformation and misinformation uh, creating a rupture between us and our government, or did that rupture exist and there was an information vacuum that was filled by misinformation and disinformation? So I do think part of the issue is that our link with our government is ruptured.
Hmm.
We experience the government in these kinds of bursts of procedural encounters when you need to file something, when you need to, at tax season. And the bureaucracy is clunky, it's opaque, it's archaic, it's hard to understand where things are. And what happened at the same time in parallel is that our expectations have increased because of like private sector user experience. These like seamless portals, visibility on our services and our goods that we're receiving, tracking information, right? And so our expectations for how to be delivered services has increased. And I think a lot of governments haven't kept up. And so there's this information vacuum where we don't often know what the government's up to because of these, kind of outdated procedures. And because of some scandals like what happened in Quebec, which we can get into after with the SAC-Click scandal that recently happened. But essentially, it creates this information vacuum, and then it's filled by misinformation and disinformation. So when we're told very negative stories about our government, what they're up to, what they're doing, there's a space there that hasn't been filled by positive encounters with the government or understanding of what they're doing or civic literacy about what levels of government do what. You can probably ask most Canadians, who do you think is responsible for, garbage pickup? What level of government is responsible for foreign policy? I think a lot of us are not aware. And so when we don't have, good civic literacy, when we are not interacting with the government on a regular basis, or these interactions tend to be frustrating or unpredictable. It creates, again, this vacuum of information that can easily be filled by different narratives.
Yeah, and maybe to jump on that, having taken the Canadian citizenship exam where I had to learn which level of government, of course, was responsible for what. But I think it speaks to a few things. One is that there's then a role for government to think about how it has to be in the 2020s. And we have seen other places around the world where that reform of government has helped to reverse a trust decline. I think of Taiwan as a very good example of that, where the so-called sunflower revolution was a moment when trust was honestly in the toilet. And we saw that a government that really changed things became much more transparent. So Audrey Tang, the digital minister, for example, every meeting that they held was actually something that any Taiwanese person could go and listen to, right? Like maybe Canada's not going to go in that direction, but it's just to show that there can be moments when trust can be in the single digits and it can be turned around by government reforming itself. So this builds, I think, on Valérie's point. If we think of it as chicken and egg, what creates a susceptibility to listen to other narratives? Part of that is how responsive government is. And maybe the other thing to say is that as somebody who studies communication, I think it's also important to say when communication is not enough, right? When policies need to change as well. And so the susceptibility to maybe more problematic information or conspiracy theories is going to be high when you feel your government isn't delivering. So we always have to be careful, I think, in talking about this topic to avoid saying that this is the root of all our problems, because many things are just about policies that aren't delivering for people.
Absolutely. And I'd like to touch on that maybe a little bit later about the policies and, where can we actually act or think about acting to get kind of the best results. But before we get to that, I just wanted to build on what was just said for Jessica. In your report on what should the CBC be, you talk about many different things, but I'm wondering if you have any insights to share about the responsibility or the role of journalists specifically, as part of our, institutions, let's say, about, whether, should they address misinformation? Should they work on debunking misinformation? Is that even a viable strategy for us to think about? Or is the energy and resources that would be needed for all of this, say, debunking is just unfeasible? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. We're at a point where media is becoming more specialized. We're seeing the decline of large, big institutions that everybody trusts, which 79% of Canadians would like to see come back and be built. They think that with this age of many different sources, many different types of players and social media, it's important to have large, reliable media institutions that people trust. Um, I think we're living in a time where what a journalist is an incredibly fluid and ever-changing thing. And as a journalist and teacher, I actually really support that. The media is never supposed to have been this industry where it's like, I'm a journalist and I go out and you're not allowed in. We need I don't know if this is the right word, but like a pluralistic society where there's many different types of players and many different types of voices. And Canadians should have access to a full suite of different range and types of journalism. And what we see right now is that they don't. So yeah, for those of us that are fighting the good fight for reliable professional journalism, we need to be more transparent than we've ever been. We need transparency statements about our funding, about our reporting processes. It's really good now to see how different newsrooms are responding with AI statements. And I love the ones that are brave enough to say, we are 100% human powered and we have no AI, but most people have some combination of that. So, but I don't want to dash your hopes and spirits, but I really think policy is the answer here. I don't think the individual journalist can do the fight. And what I've seen from um, people, both at liberal and conservative outlets, is that when you try to debunk someone's accusation that you're reporting fake news, they just get more entrenched in their belief set.
Mm.
Matthew might speak to that too, but we're not actually very good right now at convincing each other that our way is right. We're more sticking in our lanes.
That's so interesting. I mean, Matthew, would you like to talk about, what Jessica just said in this way? How does this manifest in the training that you deliver or things like that?
Yeah, so we have a lot of material obviously relating to this broad topic, but when it comes to news specifically, a lot of it does have to do with helping people understand what it is that makes news different from other media and what makes a news source reliable. And to be a reliable news source and to be, mainstream are not synonymous. So we actually have a lesson that we just published a couple of months ago that is all about finding and verifying independent news sources, independent journalists, in small news sources, and learning how to judge them so that you can identify, well, do they have a process? Do they have a process for gathering facts? Do they have a process for correcting facts? Do they have professional standards? If are they either being objective or are they being transparent about their point of view? Because we know, you can't teach salmon to swim downstream when they want to swim upstream. There's no point in telling young people, well, you should all go and read the CBC or the Globe and Mail or whatever. We know they want to get their news in the same places that they're getting everything else. And they do want to get news. That's one of the things that came up really strongly in the research was that young people are interested in news, but they feel overwhelmed by it. They feel overwhelmed in terms of not knowing how to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources, but they also feel emotionally overwhelmed because when there is a big event, suddenly their feed is absolutely flooded with it. So, whatever it is, whether it is, a mass shooting, whether it is a natural disaster, or maybe it's what's happening in Minneapolis over the last few weeks. But when these things happen, everyone is sharing it, and suddenly it absolutely floods their feed, and it is absolutely overwhelming. And so, a lot of what we're teaching, young people in particular, but adults as well, it's as much about curating and limiting what they're seeing, as much as it is finding good information. Now, finding good sources is really valuable, and there's some great research that showed that one of the best ways of getting better news is to just find some reliable news sources and add those to your feed. But from the emotional perspective, it's also really important, even just to give people permission to turn it off or to mute a phrase for a little while. And this is a phenomenon that you see, really going back to the first Gulf War, which coincided with the launch of CNN. And even then, you had people feeling that they couldn't turn away, that something important might happen, or that they had almost a moral obligation to keep watching, to be informed. And of course, we have that model of the informed citizen. We say this is a good thing. We have to acknowledge this is the sense that you have to always be plugged in, that you have to always be there is unhealthy. It's unhealthy when kids are staying up till 2 in the morning to like the photos their friends posted or to be ready to weigh in on the drama that their friends are involved in. And it's just as unhealthy when they feel like they can't tune out whatever crisis is happening in the news today. And when they don't, they just disengage completely with news. And that's what we've heard. Either they feel like either they have to just expose themselves to everything or tune it out completely. So teaching them how to sift that, how to sort it out, and how to selectively mute things, either because they're not accurate or reliable or because they're just overwhelming, is an essential part of media competence today.
Yeah, that is such an insightful response. Thank you, Matthew. And I think the discussion, I like where it's going, how it's evolving. We're now trying to think a little bit about solutions and how we can kind of proactively think about this problem in Canada, and what can we do about it. So, maybe as to start this, and I would invite all of you obviously to answer this. But we've heard recently from the government of Australia that they made the bold move to ban social media for kids under the age of 16, kind of a broad ban. And since then, we've heard our culture minister here, Mark Miller, said that his office was looking at the policy's impact as they were looking to address online harms and what can we actually do about this? So perhaps, what do you think about this kind? This is a very I would say, contentious policy move. What do you think about this? What should we think about? Is this effective or should we look elsewhere? And I want to open this up for all of you.
Maybe I'll start by saying it's, in a way you could read it as a very blunt tool of desperation, right? If the platforms cannot be regulated in other ways, a ban is sort of your thing of last resort, but it also speaks to bigger questions about what about everybody over the age of 16? If the Australian government thinks this is so dangerous that it needs to be restricted completely, what happens when you're 16 years old and one day and you're suddenly unleashed into social media? So I think it speaks to also a moment in time, right? Where this is the kind of policy solution that seems to be feasible if it's focusing on kids. And there's lots of reasons why I think the Australian government has done this. And now that it's done it with perhaps less backlash than some other policies, other governments, the UK too, lots of European countries are seeking to follow suit. But I think we can also recognize that as maybe a failure of broader policies to regulate social media that would, of course, include children, but would also think about all the ways that social media need to be regulated for the over 16s as well. So my concern with this is that we end up just with a ban and we don't think about all of the things that we've been discussing. Maybe we'll get to this, but all of the kind of policy debates we've been having in Canada for years, where we've tried to come up with, I think, nuanced and smart solutions to some of these problems. And instead now we're going for the blunt instruments because the other more nuanced solutions that are broader, regulating the platforms in general, have yet to be passed.
Yeah, I have to admit I've been back and forth on this policy. I've heard compelling perspectives on the benefits and on the drawbacks. So there's a movement called democratic schools that is popping up a bit everywhere. And I recently was in Estonia, not looking at them, but I ended up learning a little bit about them. And I was speaking with someone who runs a democratic school, and what they do is that they have a bit of a different model for how they educate children. They have children decide a little bit what they want to learn, not willy-nilly. There's a framework still, but students have a lot of say in how they learn and what they learn. And they found that kids can actually make their own policy about things like the use of phones in schools if the decisions are democratized, and they can hold themselves accountable. And a lot of the classrooms are mixed age too, so you're hanging out with some older people and some younger people, and they learn from each other. So this gave me a little bit of a different perspective, because I worry, like Heidi, that, for example, I went to a French school. I wasn't allowed to speak English in school. I would get detention. And so I remember whenever I would leave, I couldn't speak to my friends in English. And then when I would leave school, I was like, oh my goodness, I can finally speak English. And I just wanted to speak English. And so I'm worried that, in the same way that we would, not allow cell phones in schools, we're also not teaching them how to live with those cell phones every day, how to put them down, how to concentrate, how to, mute certain things like Matthew was talking about. And so this is my concern. But at the same time, I'm also not an educator. And so I understand the frustrations and the challenges of, an overworked teacher already having so much to do and struggling with their focus, and then having the phones there all the time. And so I must admit, I'm very back and forth on this topic. I don't think there's an easy answer.
Jessica, did you want to go first?
I think you and I are probably going to go to the same place, but the countries that have the highest trust, whose citizens have the highest trust in public media, have media literacy programs, and they also spend the most on their public media services. So I think in Canada and in many countries, just to echo what Heidi said, there's been this presumption that if we let the free market run its course, it will find its own way. And what we're seeing right now is this blunt instrument of like, no, it clearly has affected the safety of youth in particular. And so that's now the axe is coming down. But if actually we were maybe doing a lot more of this other policy work to make sure that people had access to tools and information, we might not have arrived at this drastic step.
Yeah, I agree. And one of my big concerns about a ban is that we are moving teenagers out of the public sphere, out of the place where civic engagement happens, for good or ill. The online world is where civic engagement happens. And one of the great things about it has been that young people could be full citizens online for many years before they were able to be full citizens in our formal democracy. But at the same time, as Heidi was saying, it is a failure of policy that this public sphere is not a public sphere. It is privately owned. The places that we have, sometimes, sometimes they will, make efforts to feel like a public sphere. Sometimes for a period of time, they will be run with the sense of having a public sphere. But we've seen over the last few years that all of that is entirely subject to the whims of their owners. That you can have a platform that has a commitment to being a more or less neutral public sphere, and then turns essentially into a recruiting site for neo-Nazis, depending on the whim of a new owner. So I feel like in whatever benefits or whatever arguments there can be made for setting a minimum age. I also don't like the term ban. I find whether we're talking about banning kids from using social media or banning kids from having phones at school, in both cases, we're not talking about a ban. We're talking about a policy. And calling it a ban, I think, has a negative effect. Because it is saying that these things are bad in and of themselves. Sonia Livingstone just wrote a great article where she says, pets aren't allowed at school, but we don't say that we ban pets. We just say they're not allowed at school. But whatever benefits there may be, we are really, as Heidi was saying, we are talking about using a blunt instrument to make up, not for anything wrong that young people have done, but for the failures of our own policymaking.
Mm-hmm. I really love the aspects that each of you brought to this, and there's still a lot left to do in terms of regulating, our online spaces and how we navigate this going forward. But perhaps, to build on what you just said, Matthew, but opening this up to all of you, obviously, is there something that an everyday citizen, every one of us can actually do to push back against misinformation in their communities, even if they don't have any kind of technical expertise per se? What can you do as an individual?
It's hard because a lot of the information in our feed right now is not out and out disinformation or misinformation. It's just low quality or poor information. I say this as a person who spends a ton of time online. Like I wish someone would ban me from Instagram. And like I I think that it's so hard for an individual to discipline themselves, but I look forward to hearing what the rest of you think about that.
I struggle with this question because I feel like, our governments, our systems have created the conditions for this very problematic information ecosystem. And I don't love the narrative of responsibilizing the citizen to then have to deal with this, right? What I do say, though, about this is what you can do as an individual is empathy. I think we've lost the ability to have nuance and have calm, empathetic discussions with people with whom we disagree. So I would say, on an individual level, I always say, empathy starts at the dinner table in the sense where, you know, separate the individual in front of you from the category that they've been assigned online. I'm sure everyone's had this experience. Someone says something and it triggers something, and you think, oh, they're in the woke bucket, or they're in the alt-right bucket, or, they're an immigrant, they want to change my way of life, or, oh, they're white and Canadian, they don't understand my experience, etc. And so I would say individually, ask questions, try to understand the origin of someone's beliefs without trying to change their mind. It starts in, I think, very banal conversations. Beyond this, I think the other solutions are much bigger than the individual, unfortunately.
Yeah, so certainly the research that we've seen and some of the research that we've done ourselves shows that most people do want to help improve the information ecosystem. And we found that particularly with young people, that a significant number of young people see themselves as trusted sources of information for the people in their lives. So what we found through, again, our own research and reviews of other research is that there's kind of three different ways we can approach. When you see something that you feel you're pretty sure is mis or disinformation, um, the first is to debunk it, to say that is wrong and here is why it's wrong. And that's obviously kind of the most aggressive one that you're going to maybe use in a situation where you don't know the other person, or where there's already you're already in maybe a polarized environment. The second option is to correct, which is simply providing the correct information rather than saying this is wrong and this is how I know it's wrong. Simply saying, well, here is what I think is the right answer. And the third option is to question. And this is one of the really interesting things we found, was just asking a question, just saying something like, are you sure that's true? Or where did you get that information? Something like that. These are almost as effective as those other two options. And obviously, this can be used in a lot of different situations. It can be used if you think something is misinformation, but you're not sure. It can be used if you really want to avoid conflict. And it really is good modeling to be asking that. Is because it's always important to keep in mind, most of the time when you're correcting something or debunking it, you're not trying to change the mind of the person who shared it. You're trying to demonstrate for everyone else who's seeing what they've posted and your reply that the question isn't settled at the very least. But the other thing that's really important that I think connects to what Valerie was saying was we really do have to always remember the importance of intellectual humility. And this is fundamental to critical thinking, and it is the difference between genuine critical thinking and conspiracy thinking. Because, of course, that's one of the paradoxes that we see is the people who say they are most committed to critical thinking are the conspiracy thinkers. And we know that doesn't bear out. We know there are actual differences in effectiveness, but it's really important to, for instance, ask yourself three questions before you even start investigating something. The first is, what do I already know or believe about this? So where am I starting from? The second is, why do I want to confirm or debunk this? Because we have to be careful, of course, to be just as critical of the things, or even more critical of the things that we want to believe, the things that fit our worldview. We have to make an extra effort to be critical of those. And the third question is, what would make me change my mind? What evidence would convince me that I was wrong, or that would lead me to change my opinion? And it's that last question that is the difference between critical thinking and conspiracy thinking, because of course conspiracy theories are self-sealing. The answer to that third question is always nothing, because any evidence against the conspiracy becomes integrated as evidence of a cover-up. So that being honest with yourself about those three questions, and if you have the energy, if you have the time, countering misinformation when you see it, you're absolutely right. It shouldn't be an obligation, but I think most of us feel that we do have a responsibility to be a positive part of our information and ecosystem.
Maybe just one final thing, which builds on a question in the chat as well. And I agree that what the individual does is all micro within meso and macro systems, right? So this is not to say individuals are solely responsible. But one question was, what's the empirical evidence about linking intellectual humility and critical thinking? And we do see some psychological studies that are only looking at moments in time, but they do find things like if you push people towards thinking about accuracy, they generally tend to do a little bit better in sharing things that are more accurate, or deciding when to share and not to share. And we're talking about marginal gains here, right? A couple percent here, there. But in a networked environment, that can lead up to a lot. So asking yourself, I guess I always think of it as, if you care enough to share, you care enough to spend 5 more minutes checking on another outlet that this is a real story. And if you don't care that much, why are you sharing it or reacting to it? It's just to build on Matthew's questions, and another version of that in the literature is the accuracy nudge, asking yourself if it is accurate before you share it.
Can I add something?
Of course.
I think my answer was my initial one was a bit flippant, which is like, I don't know what we do. I think the public is being tremendously left out of these important conversations. That's partly because policy work is slow. All of us who work in that space know that just developing a piece of legislation in government and getting it passed can take years, and the technology is moving all around us. So I get why a lot of the approaches to regulation of the internet, various forms of it, social media. But I just watched our whole like public debate about the CBC kind of like rise and fall without the kind of broad national public conversation that could have yielded, for instance, the media service we want, the media service we need. And that is expensive. That there's just no getting around it. But I think for these really important things, we all have to ask for more as citizens from our government and from these platforms. And I find there's great discussion, for instance, on Reddit's Canada thread about what should be done with the CBC. And I never really see anything done with it. I'm like, go look at it. It's right there.
I love all of your answers, and it's just I'm looking at the time, and time is flying by so fast. We could have probably spent another hour talking about this topic, but I just want to address. I mean, maybe one question, if that's only the time that we'll have for, during the end of this event. Perhaps, Norman is asking, are you maybe some final comments about whether you are optimistic or pessimistic? And maybe I'm going to change the question a little bit about, what makes you hopeful about, the future in this space? Is there something that you'd like to leave us with today? Anybody could.
I can start. I think what makes me optimistic is that there are other democracies that have done well in certain respects. They're not perfect and they're not, holistically a better place, but they have done well in certain respects. And so I think one policy intervention we can act on is creating knowledge sharing networks, active knowledge sharing networks with other democracies now to see what has worked, why it's worked. Things like rethinking libraries to attract, working age professionals who are working from home a lot, maybe making co-working spaces so that people can
Mhm.
intermingle a little bit more. Realistically, right now, you don't go to the library unless you're, a kid or you're a parent with your kid, for example. And so, how can we have these public spaces where people actually go, all age groups go and hang out, and maybe we need to rethink library spaces, for example. And so, I think there are places that have some really cool solutions. I think I'll end quickly on this, but there was this really cool initiative in Ukraine, for example, where an international organization, like a nonprofit, trained the trainers. So what they did is that they gave digital literacy courses to people that were kind of embedded in the community. So for example, like hairstylists, because hairstylists all day they're talking to their clients. And so they gave these digital literacy courses to hairstylists and they would go and talk to their clients about it. And so it kind of organically cascades in society. So I would say what makes me optimistic is that there are some really cool, innovative, think outside the box ways of working through this as a society. And if we can create those knowledge sharing networks, we can start to implement things that work here.
I love that. Any other kind of closing thoughts about, hope in the future?
Yeah, maybe I'll say that a lot of the actually trust research looks better when you ask about specifics. So you ask about, say, news in general, people say they don't trust you. You ask about specific outlets, and people say they do trust them. So I think we can think a little bit more about how you create those kind of relationships. What do they look like? And Valerie has talked about the offline, and then there's also a question about how we create them online and what that looks like, not just from the federal government, but also from multiple levels of government. So that instead of government being faceless, nameless, how do you have a more reciprocal relationship that's appropriate for government communications? It makes me hopeful that there's recognition of this as a problem, right? And then we can start thinking about some more of these solutions.
Matthew, Jessica, any kind of
Well,
conclusion
I'm
you'd
just
like
going
to
to
leave
end
us?
with something that makes me optimistic and is also a plug, and that is for our Teen Fact Checking Network, who are these amazing young people who make these extremely engaging and very popular videos where they find something. And, they don't just debunk things, because it is so important that we're not just teaching people to debunk, we're teaching people to discern, to find true information, even if sometimes it seems improbable, as well as debunking things. And the work they do just fills me with so much hope.
I also feel very optimistic about young people. I don't think they're willing, the ones that I see are not willing to settle for less. They're not willing to stand back. There's a natural leadership emerging out of this very challenging climate that we're all in. And I just think, every generation has figured out different steps in the process. So that makes me feel good.
Well, with all of this said, it is exactly 1 p.m. So we're right on time. This is pretty impressive. So thank you, all of you, for being very good with your times. So I think we're gonna end it there today. So thank you, all of you, for attending this event today. We hope that the discussion was very insightful. It certainly was for me. I learned a great deal, and we could have kept talking for so long. This is such an interesting topic. Thank you, Heidi, Valérie, Jessica, and Matthew, for being here today, telling us all about the work, the very important work that you do. And I'm really glad to hear that there's a lot of hope on the horizon for all of us. So thank you all, and again, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you for having us.